Hello and welcome to the latest edition of the Testing Peers. Tonight we're going to be talking about first impressions and how your reputation may precede you. But before we get onto that, I'd like to welcome our host for tonight. So we have regular host Chris.
Hello.
And some guests we've had before, which is Dermot.
Hello.
And I don't think Sanne actually has been a guest on us, but she's well known for 9 out of 10 testers.
She's got a reputation.
She has got a reputation. Sanne.
It's good to be here, David.
And myself, David. Again, we are sponsored by Saffron QA, and Dermot has the sponsor message.
Saffron QA continue to be our sponsor, and they are also here to support the testing community. Therefore, should any of our listeners be in the market for a new job in testing or hiring new talent for your team, please reach out to Ben. He can be contacted via email at ben@saffronqa.co.uk.
Brilliantly read out. Thank you, Dermot. So, because we have a special guest, we will ask Sanne to come up with a banter this time.
All right, I'll kick us off. So my question to you today would be, what do you think your friends feel you're most known for? Who wants to start us off with that one? Dermot is giggling, so that's going to be a good one. What do you think your friends know you best for?
For me, it's probably puns. My pun game is...
Bad ones or good ones?
I can't possibly say one way or the other. All I know is that my pun game is quite prolific. As to the relative quality of that would be for others to decide. Puns and obscure sci-fi knowledge probably are the things that I'm renowned for.
These are good things.
Thank you. Thank you.
I approve. I had a birthday party for my 30th some 10 years ago, and I don't like dressing up and doing all that sort of thing. I don't like pomp and circumstance particularly, but my wife pressed me for a theme. So people would come along, we could have a particular theme. So I said, let's have the theme as dress like Chris. And that tells you a little bit when people turn up as to what they perceive you in a sort of visual aesthetic. Depending on when people knew me from, some folks were setting up in shorts in inappropriate weather. Some folks were wearing football shirts. Some were wearing backwards baseball caps.
For me, it's your appropriately phrased T-shirts. Every opportunity you get, you wear an appropriate saying on your shirt.
I try to use. I used it in a presentation today with some new clients, just to subtly aid people into my thinking around quality and such. The way I've appeared has expressed in a certain way. I guess that's a nice thing to be thought by. Sometimes less so. I mean, I had a ponytail and people thought it looked like a rat's tail, so maybe not all the time.
So did they show up at the party with a rat's tail? Was it that literal?
No one stuck one in, but there were people who were wearing their hair under a hat like how I did, and it was a bit...
Well, at least you know what you looked like in all phases of life.
All right, well, yeah.
There's a reason you moved on.
David, how about you?
For me, in work-wise, that people probably, I'm the guy with the tie. I'm one of the few, very, very few people I think they wear a tie at work all the time, even in lockdown. But socially, and actually a little bit at work, I do love my cheese. I've mentioned cheese before. So people have bought me cheese for birthday from friends and stuff. I just love cheese. So that's what I would probably...
Cheese and ties.
Yeah.
That's a certain picture as well.
My son has recently adopted a message tone for WhatsApp of James May slamming a block of cheese on a table and saying, cheese. So cheese is very much part of the social zeitgeist in my family at the moment.
Oh, well done.
And Sanne.
Yeah, what am I well known for? I know that mostly I get called up for advice. So that's something people have literally told me. They even sometimes feel guilty about it. I always call you when I have a problem and you always fix it. But I don't experience those calls that way. I just really enjoy talking to my friends. I never realized the pattern in them until much, much later when they started pointing it out. And the other thing I think I'm really well known for is for the arts and crafts I get up to, which is a very invisible part of my life, mostly when I'm being professional, Sanne. But I knit and I draw and I do all these crafty things. And I thoroughly enjoy them. So that's something I'm also quite well known for, especially for gifting those. Again, I don't tend to keep many of the things I've made. So there's a lot of hats out there that have been created by me.
Brilliant. Got a nice collection of things there. So let's get on with the topic today. Sanne, do you want to give us a bit of an understanding of where we came from with this topic, since you came up with it initially?
Well, as is typical for me and my sessions online, it started off with a bit of a moan about how we wish we could predict the situation we'd end up in with projects we take on sort of down the road. And particularly, we were bemoaning how we kind of get thrown off into the deep end when we start projects. Today is going to be about first impressions from both sides of that table, the project to you, you to the project. And then especially when from both sides, there is maybe a preceding reputation, good or bad, that you then also have to contend with within that sort of dance that you do in the beginning of figuring out who you're going to be to each other.
It's fascinating because there's so many dimensions to that, because there's the reputation that is bestowed upon you by other people, and then there's the reputation that you build for yourself. And knowingly or unknowingly, you cast people's expectation of you based on what you say, what you do, even during the interview process, if it's on foot of an interview or just communicating with people in the open, in public. You can build a reputation for yourself that isn't necessarily what you intended to build.
Yeah, and I think there's a public persona and there's a work persona. So there are sort of these hats we wear as well, and they can get intermingled or they don't. Interestingly, a lot of my projects seem to get attracted to my profile from the external things I do, and then figure out that there's a whole person and a way of working behind that isn't always reflective of each other. Somehow I feel that also lets them down occasionally. They're sort of expected more because the public persona seems to be more, if that makes sense.
That's quite a common thing, I think. You sort of perceive the, in inverted commas, air commas, famous tester must be an expert in all of the things. So if you're posting regularly on social media and you've got well-formed opinions that you've well articulated online, sometimes people believe that equals expert in all things testing or whatever you're writing about. And that can open doors for you, right? That's
awesome. Yeah.
Really exciting, and can sometimes get you an audience with influential folks that you're going to be working with that you otherwise wouldn't do if you weren't a name of some description. But it can also set you up for failure if they begin to expect all of those things of you quite early doors.
I think I remember when I was more of a junior tester or younger tester, both, that I would find myself coming into a project and then proving the trustworthiness, building that reputation, and sort of starting that from the moment you hit the ground running. Whereas these days I come in with what feels like a whole bunch of baggage that we then have to unpack together before you can even get to the whole hit the ground running phase. So you kind of have this, I mentioned game earlier, but it is that. It is feeling each other out and seeing what's actually underneath the wrapping and how are we going to figure out how to work together.
And I guess broadly, if we're bringing the listeners into this conversation, that baggage can come from anywhere. Okay, so it could be a profile that you maintain publicly, or it could simply be what's stated as fact on your resume or your curriculum vitae. The things that you've experienced can be interpreted on a purely factual level, or people can make assumptions based on what they think they read from your resume. And then they have expectations which may or may not shake out during the interview process. And then whatever that is, like if it's valid, that's fine. If it's completely fallacious, then that ultimately ends up shaking out once you're employed on the project, which is problematic at best,
And it's not even necessarily one you create, because Dermot, it sounds like you're telling a bit of a story you might have some familiarity with. So maybe you'll add a bit of personal detail in a bit, but it's frequently unintentional, actually, because people have an image and they meet you for generally half an hour to an hour in that whole getting to know each other stage. And then there's the CV, which quite honestly, I mean, we're in consultancy, I think most of us. Those are very elegantly well written, worded, especially to fit the job opening. Like they are as close to the truth as any advert, I think, is a lot of the time, which makes them troublesome as well.
Mm-hmm.
So what happened in your case? What preceded you or did not?
Many years ago, I was hired for a job that I wasn't best suited for. And that was because the company in question, I'll labor the point of saying this was many years ago. This is not any of the companies that I've interviewed for recently. But many years ago, this company needed an employee to fill a particular role, and that wasn't the role that they went looking for. So they found me. I suited the role that they advertised, but I didn't suit the need.
Right.
And that all shook out over the course of 3 months.
Well, that's relatively quick to find out. That's the one benefit, I would say. Yeah.
Indeed. But it was a novel experience for me and somewhat traumatic at the time. I can laugh about it now, but at the time it was terrible, to quote a Smiths song. But it was an eye-opener. And ever since then, I have made sure during the interview process that, okay, this is what I am, and this may be different from what you think I am. So I've had a rigor about the way that I interview for roles ever since. Because one bad experience kind of dictates that you kind of have to take on that responsibility.
A very wise thing, though, isn't it? Remembering the lesson of what he did and actioning those things based on that experience. And I think you're right, because sometimes we fall into a trap, don't we, where we're trying to present ourselves or give the impression that we are what they want in the process. And you may not have done it intentionally. We get drawn into these things quite a lot, don't we? So I can sort of relate to some of those things. It happened to me in a past relationship where someone told me that I wasn't what they expected me to be. That was a bit depressing.
Yeah, it's like the opposite of meets expectations. It's like completely misses all the expectations.
Well,
like let's part ways.
That's not feedback you're going to enjoy.
But in the end, that is what happens when you do decide then to make a switch, isn't it? It's deciding that from all the hopes and dreams that you had for this kind of working relationship together, in the end didn't meet the crucial expectations, because I don't think quit anything like that lightly. Those decisions are never made simply, but it does mean that somewhere very inherently there's a values that are now crossed. I had the expectation you were this way, or that I could be this way, and that is now very clear to me that's not going to happen. So now I have to make a different choice. Well, 6 months, 10 months, 12 months down the line, this is how we're going to be feeling about each other. It ain't going to be good, basically.
I suppose for most of us, you have an experience of how it went badly, like really badly.
Mental health bad, right? We're talking overtired, burnt out. Like you cross your own boundaries.
Exactly.
Like
and there are so many ways in which that can happen. Ultimately, in my experience, mental health is nearly always impacted in a bad work situation, or a situation, as we've been talking, where expectations are mismatched. Because I don't know about you, either any of you, but imposter syndrome is a part of my life.
Yeah.
So finding myself in a situation where I'm not what was expected really, really feeds into that imposter syndrome scenario. Where, you know, I do this self-examination spiral where I kind of figure out what was I thinking putting myself up for this role in the first place, kind of thing. So I kind of have to police that for myself.
Oh, that is so interesting. As someone that doesn't have imposter syndrome, that's fascinating to hear.
As someone who has imposter syndrome, I am so jazzed about the idea that you don't have imposter syndrome, and I'm so glad for you. That's
I think
awesome.
I have situations where I still have learning to do or things to live up to, or indeed some expectations are mismatched. I don't generally go into it expecting that I'm not the one that's good enough. So I don't typically have that. I am a people pleaser. I do have that hang up. So that kind of ends up in the same situation, I would almost say, because that means that if I can't meet the expectations of the project around me, I do feel very badly about it. And I have that sort of hang up going for me. But it's never that I think that it's because I'm not good enough, which I find really fascinating, because I know a lot of people will always say this thing about imposter syndrome. Like, I don't never feel it, but rarely.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm glad. It's just an extra thing that has to be managed.
It's interesting about, we're talking about reputation. Sometimes our own personal reputation, we don't actually realize how other people see us. And so actually talking about the imposter syndrome, people don't see that necessarily in ourselves. People think that I'm quite confident and know what I'm doing, but actually that's a persona. I question absolutely everything that I almost say or do, and will push people forwards much more than I push myself forward, which is really quite tricky. And people don't see that. They don't appreciate the struggles I go through. That's probably damages a bit my reputation, because I'm not seen as the sort of go-getter or whatever that others might expect of me.
I think part of the trick might be to be that authentic from day one, although that's scary. I agree. But honestly, mental health wise, is there any better option?
And I would contend that, David, that you have go-getter in you, but nobody has the go-getter attribute 100% of the time.
No.
So I would contend that there is an element of imposter syndrome going on right now, where you're saying you should be a go-getter 100% of the time, but it's not the case.
No, and that I think is the other disillusionment. It's not just that you can't be a go-getter all the time. It's that you can't always have the privilege of a project, a team, or an assignment that completely suits you in all your eccentricities. I think that's another expectation that is part of this dance, whereby, especially as a consultant, of course, that's a trap you can fall in, because there's always greener grass. You can always kind of try for the next one. There's no, like, I'm in this for years and years.
Absolutely.
Yeah, and also actually for a consultancy is the fact that you're constantly challenged for every new project, because you are never going to understand all the context. You're never going to understand the domain that you're working in. You understand the aspects of it that you were brought onto the project for, but there will always be an aspect that you don't know. Excitement is part of the reason why I work at a consultancy, but it's also occasionally damaging, because you constantly question whether you're able to actually deliver on that particular project.
Mm-hmm.
I remember a couple of projects ago, I was again griping, because I love to. It was about people leaving the project and being replaced and having this constant churn, and how sick and tired I was of that, and that I was thinking of moving on myself. At which some very sharp friend pointed out, aren't you then doing exactly what they're doing, where you're choosing for your own priorities and health and leaving this project to do something else? Isn't that exactly what they were all doing? And that sort of drove home to me, like, right, it is my own narrative of these things that is, again, coloring my perspective. The moving on part is normal, and everyone has to, at some point, try and find some greener grass. I think that's part of consultancy as well.
Part of the agile mindset as well, isn't it? It's the point of you inspect and adapt, and you change based on new evidence and those things. And we as humans will adapt and change, as will the many different reputations that we will have in different circles. And you will discover that depending on which circles you are moving in today, you may end up finding yourself having reputations that are from 5-10 years ago, depending on what sort of stuff maybe you were doing back then, or whichever colleagues you have run into on those bits. Because I don't think there's kind of one set of assumptions that lays onto us, especially the longer you hang around, the more you've got these reputational aspects to yourselves. You think about, people talk about, who's your favorite Nicolas Cage movie, and people will know them from loads of different ones. There's like Disney films, and then there's violent films, and there's comedy films, and I think the same comes through with the reputations that testers have. If they've got any sort of brand, or sort of they've built around some sort of persona publicly, that's one thing. But also in the workplace, where you've had people recommend you for certain roles, especially in consultancies, where you'll get folks wanting to sort of work with you again on different engagements. And there's quite a lot of pressure when you don't know what that is. And uncovering that context, I think you get a lot less time the more experienced you are to find your feet and understand the context in those things, because you are expected to hit the ground running and to understand everything that's going on. The art, which I haven't really been able to master, is to be comfortable in that space and to accept that and to be transparent with that with the right audience, so that I, as an internalizer, don't let it destroy me, which does happen, even if on the external standpoint, I'm just happy, smiley, positive.
So
Chris.
making this a bit concrete, and I don't know if you're comfortable chatting about it, but you've both switched companies quite recently, Dermot and Chris.
This is true.
In what ways would you say you're very quickly dismantling a bit of the reputation you came in with, out of that necessity to bring back the balance that Chris just mentioned? So Dermot, maybe if you're comfortable sharing, like what preceded you that you feel you now have to very quickly dismantle?
I was relatively lucky in that my immediate management in my prior engagement were extremely supportive of the broad skills, and I would say the marketable skills that I was working on and that I already brought to the role. Okay. So they were very comfortable in using those skills, frankly, but also allowing me to market those skills internally within the company that I was hired. And they were also very comfortable with me making those skills very apparent in my public persona. Then, obviously, factors beyond all of our control took control of my situation, and I found myself looking for another job. And I was lucky enough to find an employer who knew me. And again, you could say reputation could have played a part in this, but during the interview process, I made very clear of what they may have expected of me versus what I was capable of, what I was comfortable in terms of the skills and the level of engagement that I could bring. And in this case, in my current role, everything was copacetic. And thank goodness for that.
That is lovely.
Yes, exactly.
There is hope. That is good to hear.
Exactly. But what I did find was that I found that I needed to be very clear about the level of engagement that I was comfortable with. And I needed to ascertain from the interviewing company the level to which they were willing to entertain that from a new employee in the role that they were interviewing for.
What do you mean by level of engagement? Because that's new to me. Like, what's that?
Okay. So there are companies out there who would expect of a new employee that they would be working a particular amount of hours in a week. And that's a cultural thing that varies from geographical region to geographical region. It varies between more established companies and newer companies.
Right. I get what you mean now. It's both work effort and work hours. Is that kind of where you're going with it? Yeah. It's
basically an agglomeration of those two metrics and a few others.
Do you think your reputation made them expect that you would level that up?
So what I was very clear about was that I wasn't willing to entertain the idea that any expectation or any reputation that I may have had would have dictated it beyond what my actual experience and skills were. So that was the first thing I went into the interview process, and I was prepared to shoot that down. I was prepared to say, you might think that I'm going to do 80 hours a week working on a job that can be achieved with 40 hours a week. Or you may think that I'm going to bring this level of care, even though I have a family who demand a certain amount of attention and take away from, being basically this professional person 24/7.
Yeah.
So I set my boundaries, I set my limits, and I was more than willing to shoot down any preconception that was expressed about what they may have thought that I was willing to do in a particular situation.
Mm-hmm. That is good advice. Like be very open and clear, even when they don't lay out their preconceptions. You can maybe anticipate some of them and address them. I would say that's a good advice in general.
there are some questions that you can bring to bear that might surface that. I'm speaking from a position of experience. I've been in this role or along this path for a considerable amount of years, and it's easy. I appreciate that it's easy for me to say, well, you just don't let them. But as a new tester, as somebody who's new in the industry, it may be difficult for a person to do that. But
yeah, but then they don't come in with the baggage, so that makes a huge difference as well. You're not kind of battling the preconceived notions that might already be there. Like, that's the downside, right?
that's true. If somebody was transitioning from one testing role into another, assumptions may be made about what they've already done.
Yeah.
So it's just worth bearing in mind that as somebody who has hired, there's an easy trap you can fall into, for example, where you have a role that you need to fill and you can completely overlook any aspect that makes the candidate unsuitable for their role because you have a role you need to fill.
Yeah.
Okay. So looking at it from the other point of view, it's very easy to just kind of breeze past all of these potential red flags from the employer side and just say, we just need somebody. And then it becomes just kind of a seat filler, a seat warmer, so to speak. And that's not going to be a good situation for either the employer or the employee. The employee does not value being a seat warmer in any situation. They want to contribute.
And also, actually, the company, if they set themselves up to go, oh, this person's a seat filler, actually, then again, the employee has been given this reputation of just being there to make the numbers up rather than actually being there on their own merits, which is a disastrous thing for the start of their career or their time at their company.
Fog boy was a term that we used in the dim and distant past in a company that I worked for. Essentially, anyone who could fog a mirror was considered a legitimate candidate for certain roles.
I'm glad you clarified the word fog there, Dermot. Thanks.
Exactly. Yeah. No, but I mean, it could be taken in a variety of very bad ways. But even so, the
it fills
manner,
a hole.
Yeah. Right. But the manner in which it was taken was very, very negative.
Yeah, it's just a warm body to sit in a seat. Although there's a bit of both in every job opening. I mean, they do need somebody to fill the seat. And it is at that point still slightly interchangeable who fills that seat. Mm-hmm. Except that as you get on in any job, it starts to shape itself to both expectations, to character, and hopefully manage to do a bit of job crafting as well. But it does start out as a very cold kind of, we have a need and we see you having some things on your CV that can maybe help us out. So it does always start off that coldly. Mm-hmm. Except indeed, yeah.
Another thing that happens is sometimes that companies go, oh, we need a new Chris, or we need a new Dermot, or this is the new Sanne. And actually that is again so dangerous because immediately they're being cast in they've got a predecessor and they need to live up either to the reputation of the predecessor or that in other people's minds, this is the new person. So therefore they'll have the same skills. Whereas actually every individual has different skills and they're not going to replace like for like. But by adding that name to the introduction or to the recruitment process, immediately forms this reputation or this image that they are going to be replacing that particular person, which is incredibly dangerous.
This is culture add, not culture fit, David. I believe you've said this on the podcast before.
Many times, yes.
I'm just really curious, and I seem to be asking a lot of questions, but jump in if you have your questions of your own. The public reputations or the public persona or personal brand even, which I think a lot of us have and do foster, certainly I do, is that an ad? Or is that indeed also a very much something that also gets in the way? Because in personal branding, you're encouraged to find a niche and be very strong about that and to really develop an opinion within that space. But that's not always the work you get, is it? Like you can be talking and writing about a whole subject matter that maybe in your day job barely even comes across your desk.
It can be very aspirational, I think.
That too.
And depending on the intention and the the drive or the ability that you have. Sometimes personal brands kind of just happen. Sometimes you just talk about things that are literally going on around you, and sometimes you talk about things that you want to be spending more time. And the first time I ever met you, Sanne, you were the blockchain tester, right?
Yeah, that's true. I was still very specialized.
Those things do stick sometimes with people more than otherwise. Certainly when I started publishing stuff from a testing perspective and having at least a conscious effort that what I was putting online could actually have lookup ability for me, I didn't really know what I was aiming for. All I was trying to do was help the people around me with the hope that perhaps that might be helpful in the future, which sounds kind of fluffy, and I get accused of being fluffy quite a lot. Perhaps that's part of my reputation. The intention is to be broad enough that I was always conscious with cultivating some sort of reputation via what I was publishing or creating, that I wasn't speaking to a niche. And that came from a place where both myself and David came from, where we were operating in a software testing community that had a real fixation on web. And we didn't come from a web background. And I think a lot of what I was doing, therefore, was I want to ensure that I'm not just speaking to my niche, I'm speaking to how broad and accessible software development is. And so therefore I've kind of that inclusivity, and what that looks like to me and what my intention is may well not be how it's perceived, but that's where it sort of came from, I think, from me.
Interestingly, I reviewed CVs from 2 testing peers who both managed not to list doing this podcast. So that's another interesting one in terms of personal brand and reputation. So apparently both felt in writing the professional sort of CV that this wasn't a part of that, whereas that's probably when people Google you, how they find you, I would expect.
And personally, I feel like there's a general dearth of fluffiness in this industry. So kudos to you, Chris, for bringing fluff into the
I've also been accused of being too focused on quality being a people thing. So if that's the biggest stick I'm going to get beaten with for being fluffy and people-centered, I'm very comfortable with that.
Yeah,
as you should be.
If ever the retirement party occurs and we are allowed to be there, we shall give you the fluffiest of tester awards, Chris.
I will accept that with great deals of warmth. I had a thought, in looking on, we all know each other, but we also know people with reputations of brands. Have we ever been compelled to not so much intervene, but to sort of speak with folks we know who maybe have reputations or potentially have a reputation that could potentially be damaged or hurt by particular things that maybe they're pursuing, like maybe on ethical grounds or associations with groups or people that maybe wouldn't help them? Because I'm conscious that we've talked a lot about personal brand, our own sorts of things, but have we helped and aided friends, maybe leaning on positive things rather than just steer away from that place?
To just kick that off, I think in general, if you're gonna make these deprecating jokes and be about the things that you find annoying and maybe have a bit of a rant, just be very aware that you turn those inward and you very much stay away from being so hypercritical of one specific thing, even though that might be the trigger at the moment. Generally, it's enough to sort of figure out what it is about yourself that makes you annoyed about the thing, which is a very stoic way of looking at it. Of course, I'm aware of that, but it is helping some very highly opinionated, incredibly smart people understand that their critique can be given without singling out a single target. I think that's advice I've given many times.
Yeah, there's a Zen aspect to this. Like something may trigger you down a particular rabbit hole in pursuit of bettering yourself and the industry at large, but you do have to kind of extract yourself out of the situation. You have to figure out, to what extent is this my own biases, my own unconscious biases, or biases that maybe I've constructed over several years of working within a particular context and industry, how much of what I'm saying is very specific to my own take on the subjective situation that I find myself in. How much of that is actually applicable in a broader sense. So you may go off on a rant, but it's important to kind of examine what it is you're saying, examine the impact of what you're saying, and examine how that goes beyond even the particular context that you're talking about. We've all actually, during the course of this particular podcast recording, we've all made a point of being kind of abstract about the things that we're talking about in terms of companies we worked for example, and stuff like that. That abstraction can make the points that we're making seem applicable in situations that we didn't intend. Especially, I think that it's easier when you're writing things, but just in general, when you're expounding within the industry, just maybe take a step back and consider, could this be taken in a way that I didn't intend? Could it be taken in a way that's going to take the legs out from some aspiring person within the test discipline or within software development in general, and unseat them, make them feel like their contribution isn't going to be valuable?
I would add, Dermot, that it's a learned behavior.
Yeah.
Yes.
Everyone here has also learned this abstraction level through hard knocks.
Absolutely.
And you're entitled to sort of bump your nose. But it's like our intention is, when we talk to people and give them this advice, it's like we're trying to not have you crash through the window. Like, it's fine if you're going to hit the window and sort of bounce off it a bit. It's okay to bruise yourself, because that's how we all learned. But it's like preventing the crashes, I think, is what you kind of want to do. Like, the career-ending crashes are the ones we actively will reach out to people on. It's like, you might be heading towards that glass window there. You might not want to do that.
But then I think it's beholden upon us to, with experience, to model good behavior when we're called out on bad behavior.
Oh, too bad there's so many bad examples online.
There's something also to recognize here. We've all been speaking from our experiences, and no matter how we do it, how much we do it, we're probably quite good at making us still sound quite smart when we're talking to each other. And we're all fallible individuals. We all make mistakes. Heck, I've made the same mistakes in several different jobs. You just kind of get stuck in these cycles sometimes. But I think what we're modeling here is discussing it, sharing those things. A lot of what we've spoken about here is if you're not fronting up, it's accountability. It's being transparent and communicating these things, trying to set the right expectations so that assumptions don't end up being the termites of relationships, as Henry Winkler put it. So I think we're going to have to draw it to a close, because David, bless him, who's in his car, friends, because there was a power cut, has told us that we're running out of time. And while we could probably talk for hours, I think, listener, you probably want to be able to move on. Thank you very much to Sanne and Dermot and to David in his car for joining us today. We really, really value you giving up your time to be on the pod. We also really value all the feedback that you give, the support that you give. And if anybody wants to provide us with more feedback, we would absolutely love to hear from you. We're closing in on 100 episodes, listener. We're getting quite close. I think this may be episode 92. David will confirm or deny that.
Yes, it is 92.
So there you go, episode 92. That's pretty exciting. And we thank you for listening to us. If you want to find us, you can find us at testingpeers.com. You can contact us at testingpeers.com. We are on most of the socials, even some reason we're still on Twitter, LinkedIn, we're on Blue Sky, we're on Instagram. I think we might even have a Facebook page, who knows? But you'll be able to find us, search for Testing Peers, and reach out to us, leave a comment, share, tell your friends. Let's get to 40,000. Hooray!
And they're on Patreon too, folks, so you can also support them quite directly.
Patreon.com
like and subscribe.
/ Testing Peers. Like, subscribe, feedback.
Write a review.
If you see us in person and you don't hate us, tell us how much you've appreciated the stuff we've done. We like it. If you want new ideas for things to talk about, who knows, maybe, David, I can get to 50 minutes and you can be really irate when we're editing this. Jokes. But thank you very much. Really, really, really important discussion. I think I'd love to hear more people's thoughts on this in the future as well. Thank you, Dermot and Sanne, and we shall see you / not really, it's a podcast, next time.
For now, it's goodbye from the testing peers.
Goodbye.
Goodbye.